Good morning.
Good morning.
I hope everyone's doing well. Let's go ahead and pray and jump into this because we have a review we need to do. So let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll start. Lord, thank you so much for who you are. Thank you for your nature. Thank you for your word, which you've given to us, and the wisdom that we can glean from it, not just for the future, but also for the present, and how we can use your wisdom and leverage it to make wise decisions and see things as you see them. Pray, Lord, that this would be beneficial and instructive, um, and that you would be glorified. For it's in your Son's name. Amen. Okay. Now, I know that most of you remember everything that I've taught, but for those of you who have not, I thought that this would be beneficial to do a review of some of the main points and topics that we've talked about within the book of Ecclesiastes itself. Of course, we're not going to cover everything again, but I think there are some things that I kind of want to talk about and expand on, and I thought that that would be beneficial for us to do before we get into Daniel, which everyone is excited about for some reason, including Will. I think he's told me this like 5 times.
More.
Yeah, plus 5 more. Yeah. So let's go ahead and jump into the high points of chapter 1. We start off, as we've been talking about in our previous lectures, that really Koheleth is doing a research project of his own. And he starts off with his thesis statement, which is in verses 1 and 2. And that is, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. The word Koheleth in the Hebrew is the word preacher. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Now we played with, is this really Solomon? Is it not Solomon? We talked about that for a little bit in our first lecture on this, and we concluded that it was indeed Solomon based upon the details of Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and following. So Koheleth, that is Solomon, begins with the statement that everything or all, the Hebrew word there is kol, all is vanity, kol, is temporal. It is like a breath, a vapor, right? It's here 1 minute and it's gone, right? Like a mist. And that everything does not last. And everything under heaven has a shelf life, right? And this is the significance of the word or the work havel. Vanity is the Hebrew word there, havel. And that Koheleth will carry this thesis throughout the entire book. I think he's demonstrated that throughout this book, right? He's used this term havel throughout the entire text, right? We had discussed in chapters 1, verses 4 and following, he begins to start to observe creation and people and how it is cyclical in nature, right? He talks about the circuit of human life versus the land and the earth in verse 4, right? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth itself remains forever, right? That people pass on, and that's replaced by a new generation, and that continues on. That really doesn't change much, right? People inherit the houses that we live in, things like that, right? Then he talks about the circuit of the sun in verse 5, and how the sun continues on the same circuit, the same trajectory. It does not change, right? It is fixed. He talked about the circuit of the wind and how the wind continues to swirl along, right, in a circular motion. And then he brings up in verse 7 the circuit of the water, how the rivers flow into the sea, but the sea's never full. It doesn't overflow at all, right? And the water goes back into the rivers and then returns again. He mentions that. By the way, this is the basis, or what I would call the literature review of this particular section. He's giving the pattern of life. If the pattern of life is this, if a generation comes and a generation goes, right, and everything seems to remain the same, right, nothing ever changes, well, then what's the point of all of this life that we've been given here? What's the point of reality itself? Why are we here then, right? He also talks about the trends in verse 10. Is there anything of which one might say, see, it is new, already as it existed for ages, which were before us? New and improved is a lie, right? It's just the same old thing with veneer on it. We talked about this word too, leb. He mentions this in several places, particularly in verses 12 and following. He says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. I have set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. Right? It is a grievous task by which given the sons of men to be afflicted with. There are 4 observations about this Hebrew word leb, which is sometimes it's translated heart, other times in this text it's translated mind, depending on what version you're using. Four observations is that the heart that he uses in this text, leb, is immaterial. It's not talking about this heart, okay? This one beating in the center of our chest. It's talking about the area of thought, reasoning, and understanding, the function of it, okay? It is the place where we understand things, where we think about things, we muse about things, we try to comprehend things. Koheleth is going to use his mind or his heart to focus on this particular research. Again, the heart is an activity found in the spirit, or what I would refer to as the immaterial aspect of a human being. Okay? And consequently, because this is a function or quality that we have as human beings, this feature is one of the things that makes humanity unique from other creatures, such as animals and things like that. Animals do not reason like we do. They don't create paintings and designs, and they don't think about the functions of life and ask deep questions, right? But we do, and that is because of this particular function that we have. There's one other aspect of this text that is important, one word that is necessary for this discourse, and that was the word wisdom. The word wisdom itself. It is kokma, right? This word here. This word occurs 149 times in the Hebrew scriptures and 28 times from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 12 of the book of Ecclesiastes. Okay. And of course, it is translated wisdom. In some other places, it's translated skill or prudence as a quality and characteristic of being shrewd, right? Some of the qualities concerning Chokmah, which we had outlined was important for this discourse in the book of Ecclesiastes, is that the source of all wisdom comes from God. Okay? God is the source of it. There is no wisdom that is outside of God, right? God has given it all to us. And creation reflects God's wisdom. As a matter of fact, we find that Koheleth uses a lot of examples of nature to underscore his points. Okay? One such example is in chapter 1, what he just looked at, the cyclical nature of things, right? And he does this all throughout the book of Ecclesiastes as well. Notice that the law was given to Israel as God's wisdom. We talked about that. And the fear of the Lord is also wisdom, which is the scriptures, the text, right? So all wisdom comes from God. The source of all wisdom comes from God. And God has given this to humanity by his grace so that we may learn how to observe things and see things properly from his perspective. Koheleth is going to use wisdom. He's going to use wisdom, which comes from God, to analyze the activities of human beings. Okay? It is the lens or the filter by which he will use to analyze this. So these words, that is wisdom, Koheleth uses, are not just discussing the actions, but the thought and motivation behind them too. That those who pursue these things under the sun for their own sake are engaging in folly and not thinking rationally. He uses this in chapter 1, verse 14 and following. He says, I've seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. Verse 15, what is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem, and my mind has observed the wealth of wisdom and knowledge. I've set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. That those who think and act in fallacious ways are not thinking rationally. As a matter of fact, they're denying reality when they do this. However, those who seek to know wisdom live in reality. That is the reality in which God has created it and how things ought to work. Koheleth ends the chapter 1, by telling the congregation of Israel his conclusions and the method used to ascertain this information. It says the rest of the book is Koheleth going through the different perspectives and observing if they have an advantage or profit for humanity. So he starts off in chapter 1 telling us what he's going to do and the means and method by which he's going to do it. And the rest of the book is him examining all of these particular activities of humanity and assessing it with God's wisdom. Okay, chapter 2. Chapter 2 starts off pretty interesting because Koheleth points to himself. He uses himself as a case study. Before he starts to observe everything else, he uses himself and his own experiences to assess with wisdom. In chapter 2, verse 1, he begins, come, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So enjoy yourself. And behold, it too was futility, temporal, right? This word pleasure that we took a look at here that was in red, Koheleth used in this context is what would give personal, consistent satisfaction in life under the sun. He's asking himself, will this pleasure give me longevity? Can I look back, and still feel fulfilled in this activity? Again, if you go back and recall the purpose statement in verse 1, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What is the purpose of all of this, right? This is what he's looking to his own life for and his own activities. Okay. We talked about, this was kind of a rather odd statement in verse 2. We kind of looked at this one. I said of laughter, it is madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? And we asked the question, what does this mean? Does this mean that we're supposed to walk around stone-faced all the time, not enjoy ourselves? What exactly does this mean? And I asked a couple of questions. It says, the first one I asked is, what does his following statement about laughter mean? I said of laughter, it is madness. I mentioned that the term here, laughter, is really kind of a misnomer. It's kind of oddly translated. It actually should be translated as enjoyment instead of laughter. Okay? because it's not talking about the activity of laughing itself. That's not what it's referring to, but it's referring to the perception or the outlook of the person. Okay. Looking at Koheleth's overall activities, the things that he details from verses 3 and following. Again, what was his activity and why did he come to these conclusions? That is, he mentioned that this was all madness. It was vanity. It was useless, the things that he did. Why did he come to such conclusions in chapter 2? The answer was his activity, when observed with wisdom, revealed that there is a short-term satisfaction to these activities. It's not that these activities are bad in and of themselves, but if we look to them for our overall purpose in life, we will be very disappointed because they don't last very long. So, but pursuing pleasure for the sake of pleasure is irrational. It is unrealistic. It is foolish. We can enjoy ourselves, but if we think that that is our overall purpose, is just to build things and create legacies and things like that, we will find that we may be disappointed, as Koheleth was disappointed. This led to our third question: does Koheleth believe that pleasure is bad? That we should throw it all away? And we had concluded, based upon some of the particular language and looking at some of the points that he was making, is no, pleasure is not necessarily bad, or enjoyment. It's what is needed is wisdom to realize that these activities that we engage in are only temporal, and that they don't give us a sense of purpose or a sense of worth or a sense of value. Okay? That our value ought to be found elsewhere. Okay? Koheleth informed the congregation of Israel that he regarded all of the activities that he did, planting vineyards, having musicians, even the pleasure of many women and things like that. They regarded all the activities that he was involved in and all the works that he detailed in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 10. He turned to consider or observe wisdom, madness, and folly. Let's go ahead and read a couple of verses here. I'll start at verse 9 of chapter 2. Then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom stood by me. All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. For my heart was pleased because of all of my labor, and this was my reward for my labor. Again, this is a good thing. Verse 11. Thus I considered all my activities with which my hands had done, and the labor which I had exerted, and behold, all was vanity and striving after the wind, and there was no profit under the sun. We had mentioned that earlier. Verse 12. So I turned to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? And I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. So he compares wisdom to madness and folly, and he realizes that wisdom is much better, right, than folly. Of course it is. However, he makes this statement in verse 15. Actually, I'll start at verse 14. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know there's one fate that befalls them both. Then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, so it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So he says that there's an advantage to wisdom, but then he turns around and goes, well, wait, I know that there's one fate that befalls them both. Koheleth mentioned that even though wisdom gives the person a proper perspective and advantage regarding life under the sun on this land, one event or happenstance comes to claim both the wise and the foolish person. And that event or that happenstance is that of death. Death comes to claim the foolish person and the wise person, no matter who they are, right? He also mentioned, too, that because of this, because of dying, one who is very influential may be forgotten from memory, right? Koheleth mentioned it was because of these truths, that is, that no one would remember him or his work, and that his name and reputation would be gone from humanity's memory. This would cause him to become cynical. If I live my life wisely and no one remembers, what's the point of that? Right? That doesn't make any sense. We talked about this, that building one's legacy ought not to be the purpose of one's life, because over time, one will forget. They will remember because life goes on without us, right? So material possessions we can't look to give us any purpose or value or any meaning, right? Because those things have temporal satisfaction. And we can't look to building a legacy. That can't be our overall purpose either, because over time, people will forget it. And I even remember, and I even mentioned too, that there are lots of famous people, celebrities, things like that, whose names we forget. How much more the common person? Then we got to the end of chapter 2, which was a rather interesting, a rather odd statement. Verse 24. He says this in chapter 2, there's nothing better than for a man to eat, drink, and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen, it is from the hand of God. So he mentions to enjoy your labor while you have it, because it is God-given. Verse 25, for who can eat and who can drink and have enjoyment without him? Same word there for pleasure. Verse 24, for to a person who is good in his sight, he is given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner, he is given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to one who is good in his sight. That's an odd statement of Koheleth, right? And we asked a couple of questions concerning this. So what does he mean by this, right? What does he mean that a sinner has the task of collecting for those who enjoy God, for example, or who are good in his sight? Well, when we talked about this, remember how we mentioned that this is a descriptor or an identifier, good in his sight. This is a person who fears or reveres the face or the sight of God. This is one who uses wisdom, right? Who believes God, who is convinced of his word, who's good in his sight, right? When it talks about the word sinner, it is not talking about the same group. This is also an identifier of a person who does not fear God, okay? Or the face or the sight of God. We talked about that. So these two groups are different, okay? And they don't switch places, okay? They're two different individuals, because these are individuals who are good in the sight of God, or those who are sinners in his sight. So based upon, again, our looking at this statement very closely, and if you want to know some of the mechanics and details, go back to chapter 2 and look and listen to that one. What does this entire statement by Koheleth mean? This statement, again, is to encourage the congregation of Israel to change or strengthen their focus based upon Koheleth's account. If they have an account, or if they have a focus that their enjoyment, their overall value, their worth things like that comes from collecting goods and doing things. They need to change their perspective. Or if they have that, they need to strengthen that. Okay. Now, why did Koheleth place this thought here in this discourse? Again, this is the discussion portion of Solomon's research project. Remember, Solomon is the king of Israel. He has great influence, right? And so if he, by the wisdom of God, makes this analysis, comes to this conclusion based upon the wisdom that he has, well, then there's no greater perspective that one ought to have. There's no alternative, right? Because the king has done this himself. He's come to this conclusion using God's wisdom. Okay. High points from chapter 3. Chapter 3, besides chapter 11, is probably one of my most favorite chapters. It is amazing. Okay. And it should give us a lot of comfort, because we live in a culture that seems to think that we have to do things bigger, better, faster. We have to be this ultra Chad or Chadress, right? That if you're living a regular mundane life, you're just a peon, right? And yet we find in chapter 3 that that's exactly what God wants us to do. He wants us to live plain Jane vanilla lives, zero action going on, right? Zero. Okay? And he starts off by telling us all of the events that occur under the sun in chapter 3. In this statement concerning the activity in humanity, of how the activity of humanity on this land or on this earth is fixed, it is fixed, much like the circuit of the sun or the circuit of the wind or the circuit of the water. Everybody at some point goes through similar or same events. It must be noted, too, that Koheleth is not making value judgments. He's not saying, well, this event happens and this event is bad, or this event happens and this event is good, right? There's a time to kill, but that's bad. He's not doing that. He's basically saying that in the course of human activity, these things happen. People are born, people die. There are conflicts, there are not conflicts. These things come and go. Nor is he promoting, again, that God approves of these activities. He's merely observing these things from an unbiased view. This is the most unbiased view of these events that you could possibly observe, that Koheleth is possibly giving to us. Okay? And he points out that Koheleth once more points out to the audience his firsthand observation of humanity's business on the land, and that this business is true of everybody. Okay? That is the point of verse 11 of chapter 3. He goes, he's made everything appropriate, in some translations beautiful, but I think a more proper translation is appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. We are not to know that because God has given us all the activity that's necessary for us to do here, which is why in verse 12 of chapter 3, he mentions the following: I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. Verse 13, moreover, that every person who eats and drinks and sees good in all of his labor, it is the gift of God. That's Wonderful news. Because the activities that we do in our lives are things that God has established for us. This statement by Koheleth in verse 11 and following underscores that all the activities that are done under the sun from the perspective of what God has prescribed for humankind, when we operate in wisdom and do those things that God has prescribed for us, that he's given to us, these things are appropriate for us. They're right. He mentions in his statement, this is kind of the sine qua non in this chapter. He's told the congregation of Israel the purpose of why God has placed eternity in the minds of humanity. Again, with the sole purpose that humanity will not know all ends of God's work, but may explore and ponder the work of God from beginning to end, again, which leads to the next statements by him. We are not to know these things. We can ponder them, but we will not know them. And why is that? Because of the fact that God has already given us tons of things to do. Koheleth's thought concerning the activity of humanity is to have a favorable state of being about their activity, that is to enjoy it, and to do things that are good from the perspective of God. That Hebrew word is tov, right? Every time we see that word tov, that is good from the eyes of God, from the perspective of God. And that those who are sustained physically ought to see this is what God has given humanity freely to do, to recognize that God has given this labor for humanity's sake. Koheleth's statement speaks to also the permanency of the work of God. He mentions this in chapter 3, verse 14. I know that everything God does will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it, and there's nothing to take from it. That includes the things he's given to us to do. There's no conclusion or no limit to how God has established that humanity ought to conduct itself on the land. We are not to be going out slaying dragons. That's not what we're supposed to do. We are to get busy leading very vanilla lives, very plain Jane lives, because that's what God has given us. As I mentioned, Koheleth underscored the mundane, regular, vanilla activities in life, and this is what God delights in and approves of. There's often this fear of missing out. Well, if we use wisdom, we don't miss out on anything. That's a poor perspective to have. FOMO is the term. There ought to be no FOMO with us, unless, of course, we aren't using wisdom. Then we're missing out, right? And then Koheleth mentions that the activities at the present time that are approved of God, a person ought to spend their time focusing on, right? Not building a legacy or slaying dragons or whatever the case is, but to live regular lives, raising our children, loving one another, things like that. Working, being a good employee, things like this, because these are the things that God delights in. Okay, high points in chapter 4. Real quickly here. Koheleth brings up the activity of humanity under the sun as it relates to two groups of people. This is a very dark chapter, right? People who are being crushed by people with power, the oppressor, and those who have power and are crushed by those who do not have power, the oppressed. And I find the statement to be very interesting of Koheleth because he says basically both are at a loss. Both are not comforted. Okay? The oppressor who is seeking power is not comforted. And the one who's being crushed by the oppressor is not comforted. Both lose. Once more, Koheleth makes a sobering observation in verse 4 about the nature of humanity and those who conduct themselves in this way, that those who actually oppress others do so out of the jealousy they have for those whom they serve. That's fascinating to me. They may use their power to either prevent people from having what they themselves have, or they will use their power to take away from those who have what they want. I mean, all of the kingdoms and things like that we've seen, this could be a case study that we could look at for a long time. But at the heart of them is one of those two things. They don't want people to have what they have, so they're restricted, or they will take away. The outcome is the same, and they crush them for this reason, out of the jealousy that individuals experience. That's verse 4 of chapter 4. Koheleth ends this line of reasoning with his signature saying that this is a useless endeavor to act this way, that the oppressor's activity and character serves no one. It is destructive, wicked, and leads to physical and emotional pain and strife, not just for the person that they're oppressing, but themselves as well. And ultimately, this person with this conduct, Koheleth refers to as a fool. That is verse 5. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Foolish. The rest of chapter 4, there are 3 activities that Koheleth seeks to address in this chapter. Enjoying one's labor, we see this in verse 8, that he looks again and talks about the reward for one's labor. The value of companionship in activities, that having a companion with you is a strong quality to have. He uses the cultural reference of a 3-strand cord, right? He's not talking about, it's God and you and the missus or whatever. That's not what he's using. He's using to talk about the strength of a 3-strand cord, that it's not easily breakable. And when you have a companion, that's a good thing. And the purposelessness of being an influencer. Yeah, there's a lot of those these days. Koheleth says that this is foolish because they'll love you one day and then hate you the next, right? They'll already seek to replace you after they found you. So we can't look to material possessions. We can't look to legacy building and things like that, nor can we look to popularity of people, because we as human beings are very fickle, right? And he ends chapter 4 that way. High points in chapter 5. Again, chapter 5, another interesting chapter. Koheleth mentions a particular practice that took place under the law. That's verse 1. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. It's not talking about this fellowship here or this building. It is talking about the temple. Okay. So this is an activity that is taking place under the economy of law, that when one goes to the temple, they better don't speak, watch your words, right? Speak intentionally. Again, Koheleth's statements were directed to the nation of Israel during his rulership, and these statements were made during the time that there was a temple to make these vows. When you go to make a vow, don't do so with intention. Don't just go just to go, Again, Koheleth underscored the activity of the Levitical priest. That's in verse 4 and following. Then he mentions something that is in verses 8. Okay. From verses 4 to 7, he concludes basically fearing God is the best thing to do, particularly when you go to the temple and using your words intentionally. Fear God when you do this. Then he mentions again in verse 8, he kind of re-racks kind of what he talked about in chapter 4, that the crushing of those who have little influence and resources will always be a reality due to the activities of humankind. People will always take advantage of others, and people who oppress will oppress others, typically because individuals go along with the program, which is what he mentions in the next statement. He mentions, if you see the oppression of the poor, verse 8, and denial of justice and righteousness in the province, do not be shocked at the sight, for one official watches over another official, and there are higher officials over them. Right? After all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. When you see oppression, don't be surprised that you see it, because there are people who will go along with this. They'll just follow orders. Again, we see this throughout history as well. Many kingdoms and empires and stuff like that have manipulated others and have used citizens to oppress other citizens. And lastly, the king always profits from the land that they govern over for his own purposes and objectives. That is the last statement there. Okay, continuing the last part of chapter 5, Koheleth informs the reader that if a person who is wealthy, he talks about one who has a perspective of their wealth being what they live for. If one has that perspective, they will obscure themselves from the proper perspective, that is wisdom. And as a result, they will become very cynical, very critical about life, and hostile overall. If their perspective is that they live for money, they live for silver, they live for resources, they will become very embittered. Okay, home stretch here. High points in chapter 6. This is an interesting chapter here. Koheleth, in his hypothetical, he starts off in chapter 6, verse 1 with a hypothetical that brings up that even if a person who has been blessed materially or physically with children and long physical life, and yet they have a poor outlook. I believe this is a continuation of what he talked about in chapter 5. And they finish their life shamefully. It would have been good or qualitatively better if this person had never even existed in the first place. That is a strong statement, right? Because they did not use their life and the things that they were given well. They squandered it, right? Koheleth in the next statement, that is in this chapter, underscored that the one who is untimely born and never examines the sun never acquires knowledge such as this. According to the perspective of Koheleth, the baby that was untimely born is better or gets more rest than the man who lived with his perspective and finished shamefully. That's all that, man, that's a 1-2 punch, right? Like if you finish poorly, you destroyed your life. It would have been better if you never existed, right? That's pretty incredible. Of course, again, Koheleth is observing this under wisdom. Koheleth makes the statement of the fact of the matter concerning the whole of humanity and their outlook in chapter 6. That the sole purpose of eating, yet his perspective is he's never filled. Again, this emphasizes this argument that Koheleth makes throughout the chapter, right? If one lives for these particular things, they're never going to be satisfied with them. Koheleth again seems to suggest that a poor outlook is not limited or relegated to a certain social class, ethnicity, or sex. It doesn't matter. Even age, by the way. That all people have this perspective and this outlook, right? coming up to the end here, Koheleth is once more, again in this chapter, underscoring the importance of focusing on the good, those things from the perspective of God in one's life, and how to live intentionally, that a person ought not to hold tightly to riches, and that a person's personal satisfaction ought to be found in the good things, that is, those things that are defined by God, right, from his wisdom, that one ought to focus on these things. Koheleth continued in this chapter to inform the congregation of Israel about the reality of death. This is found in verses 6 and 12, and how short life is. And because life is short, once more, we ought to live with intention. And then lastly, once more, Koheleth underscored that through these rhetorical questions that he asked throughout the end of the chapter. For there are many words which increase futility. What then is the advantage of man? For who knows what is good for a man during his lifetime, during the few years of his life? He will spend them like a shadow. For who can tell what a man will be after him under the sun? Koheleth once more underscored through rhetorical questions as a literary device to underscore the finite quality of physical life of humankind. No one can tell a man what will come after him, because all people will eventually pass away. So if that's the conclusion, we ought to live our lives purposefully and intentionally. Okay, onward to part 2. We will cover that and wrap up this book with chapter 2, and then onward to the book of Daniel shortly thereafter. Let's go ahead and pray. Lord, thank you so much for this wisdom. And even though we are covering just the high points of this, the high points again matter, that we are to live with intention and not look at all of these other things as the function and purpose of our life. But really the main purpose is to fear you, to look at your wisdom, to give us proper perspective about life and the information that you give us to make proper decisions about how we ought to live, and the motivation for why we make the decisions we make. May we continue, based upon the finiteness of who we are, to do things purposefully and intentionally. Thank you so much, for it's in your Son's name. Amen.